Hello, and welcome back to another episode of the Campbell County Trunk Show presented by Postmark LaFollette right here on WLAF. As always, I'm your host, Brad Smitty, and I'm glad to have you back with us tonight. Remember, if you don't catch us live, you can catch us streaming online at the WLAF YouTube channel, or you can go to postmarklafollette.org where you can click on Trunk Show, you can see our past episodes and see our schedule for upcoming episodes, which right now will be about every 2 weeks. And currently, we're in part of a mini-series that's called The Promised Land, where we're exploring the land and the people of Campbell County. And in episode 1, we talked to Greg Miller about the first settlers in this area, and we left it on a bit of a cliffhanger to where he was going to talk a little bit about the first people in industry in Campbell County, such as Harvey LaFollette and some of those first folks here. And then later, we're going to talk with a Mr. Bill Stanley. And he's going to be our narrator for future episodes, and we're going to get to learn a little bit about him. And then at the end, I'll come back and chat with you a little bit more. But always remember, too, what we're trying to do is capture the people, the land, and the stories of Campbell County. And so we want to hear from you. On the next screen, I'm going to show you how you can do that, how you can submit your stories to us and come chat with us. Some of the major industries, that started to pop up here, like coal mining or the ore industry, the coke ovens that you can still see now right at the mouth of the Ivydale community. What were some of the early industries here in Campbell County and some of the people that found their way here to enjoy those?
Looking at the early census records, they seem to indicate that agriculture and timber was about all there was up until really after the Civil War. There's discussion of coal being discovered. They knew it was here. Dr. Walker, when he came through in his first expedition in 1748, they built campfires with coal that they just dug out of the hillside naturally and filled, I think the report was they filled up a bushel basket with it and just used it for their campfires. People knew there was coal in the area, but I don't think there was any effort to explore it commercially until the early 1850s in Campbell County, I think around 1852. Then the Civil War put that on hold until after the Civil War. Sometime later, they discovered iron. It was fairly abundant. The seams were large enough to be commercially viable, which is what attracted Harvey LaFollette. As it turns out, it wasn't, as far as quality by geologists that understand those things, apparently it wasn't the best of quality, but it made up for it, I think, in some abundance, and being close to coal, it was a natural match. If you went back in time to 1860, the 1860 census of businesses indicates that virtually every person in Campbell County was involved in agriculture. The only industry that's mentioned are a couple of iron, in the old records, they refer to them as an iron bloomery, which is a forge. And they were working some with iron at the time of the Civil War. Locally, it's where Baker's Forge got its name. That community out there was an iron forge there, one of the earliest ones. Over time, after the Civil War, they popped up all over. There's ruins of them down near Caryville, up, of course, in Ivydale, which is where the major LaFollette works were located. So they had it everywhere. And one of the major seams that the LaFollettes exploited was a vertical seam. So they dug a cave into the mountain until they hit the seam, and then they mined it going straight down. They weren't able to go back horizontally. They had to go vertically to take it out. But by the time Harvey LaFollette came along in the 1890s, he was here to exploit the iron ore. By all accounts, Harvey was a genius. He spoke several languages, was an engineer, And they were at one time, they actually constructed the largest iron blast furnace, largest blast furnace in the South, anywhere, even larger than the ones they had in Birmingham, which was famous for steel production. They actually found Harvey's cookbook, and they produced several different types of metal, steel, depending on different things, temperature and length of time and all of that. They produced it for different purposes. And probably they could make the argument that they were producing some of the finest steel in the world. Unfortunately, they were driven out of business by the larger steel companies, railroads, and such. And ironically, in the boom time of the 1920s, they went bankrupt. But they did set up a huge operation. The coal was here, which they needed for the coke ovens, the blast furnace. They could mine the ore. They built the railroads, carry it back and forth. They called it the locals, I guess the local people that worked it called it a dinky railroad. It was a small gauge track, and it went from the coke ovens in Ivydale through LaFollette, crossed the road there on a bridge, and then went down along the creek behind the Indiana Avenue Baptist Church, went over to where the blast furnace was located, which was where the newer projects are, next to the creek there where the Indiana Avenue Baptist Church is. Their laboratory was right by the curve of the road as you pass Indiana Avenue Baptist Church. And there was a swinging bridge across the creek that went over to what is now Linden Park. And that was where most of the common laborers for the blast furnace lived. The wealthier folks of the LaFollette Iron and Coal Company lived on what's known as Kings Row, which is in LaFollette. And there's still some lovely old Victorian homes on one street, and that's where the managers lived. It's right up from where the LaFollette House is, which is obviously where Harvey LaFollette made his home, and later Grant LaFollette made his home. But they were all together. The original LaFollette house comprised the entire block. And at one time, they had gas lampposts that surrounded the entire block. There's only, I think, one or two of them left now that you can still see. And of course, they've carved pieces of the property off, and it's much smaller than it was. But that's how we got Indiana Avenue, because he was from Indiana. So if you build a town, you get to name it. So that's how we wound up with that. If I recall, his wife was, I think, from Lexington, Kentucky. So that's how we got Kentucky Street and several others that were named for the various states. But he came in, and that was the first major industry. You'd ask about nationalities. Originally, the Europeans that came here were mostly settlers. A lot of them were Scotch, Irish, and English, obviously. But Harvey LaFollette imported a lot of newly arrived immigrants. Howard Armstrong, who was a famous string musician, you've probably heard of him. Well, he said that I had an opportunity to speak with him on several occasions. And he told me that by the time he left home at 16, he already spoke English, Italian, and Polish. And he learned Italian and Polish on the streets of LaFollette. So they brought a lot of immigrants in. We had Russian immigrants, people that passed through Ellis Island and wound up here looking for work. Evidently, Harvey LaFollette advertised widely. And so these immigrants came to LaFollette, and we had our own little Italian community. Locally, it was referred to as Callitown. And back in those days, I guess, nationalism and local pride and so forth, they kind of stuck to their little town, and everybody else had their little areas. And I was told that in the creek, the Italians had their own swimming hole, and the locals had their own swimming hole, and the Italian swimming hole was known as the tally hole. And so apparently one of the big things they did to each other was they would swim in one another's swimming hole, and then that would create a minor incident, and then they would chase one another about, I guess, or whatever it was they did. But apparently it was considered a considerable coup to swim in the other person's swimming hole in the creek. But and they were wonderful people, created, contributed so much to the community. A lot of the wonderful stonework that you see in LaFollette, and those foundations and walls and some of the stone buildings that still stand were by the Italian stonemasons that came from what we called the Piedmont. I think they pronounced it Piemonte, but we actually had a hotel in LaFollette at one time that was known as the Piedmont, is what it was called locally. Howard Armstrong's mother was a cook there. It's where the old Fleet building is now, minus a few stories and such, but that's where it was located. But it was named in honor of those Italian stonemasons. But they just made a wonderful contribution to the community. I don't know if a lot of the Polish ancestry folks stayed in the area after the mines closed down. Apparently there wasn't enough of them for them to have their own community, but if you walk the streets of LaFollette, apparently in the early 1920s, 1920s, you would have heard a variety of languages spoken on the streets, and some of that is still with us in the surnames. We still have a lot of Italian surnames in this area. Wonderful people. I went to school with a lot of them, and and my librarian growing up was involved in that. A lot of them had restaurants, and just wonderful folks. But that's how we got this influx of a variety of cultures in the area, which now we have a lot of people that retire here and come from different parts of the country. So really since the 1920s, at least, LaFollette at any rate has been multicultural and has been, I guess, continuously, with the influx of tourists and people from other areas that move here. And now, of course, we have people that as well internationally settle here. It still gets carrying on the tradition.
Carrying on the tradition. Just as Highway 25W, also known as the Dixie Highway, has taken so many of our family members to and from the northern part of this country and continues to bring so many people here today. People like Mr. Bill Stanley, who we want to introduce to you now as the new narrator of the Campbell County Trunk Show for some future episodes. At this time, we'd like to hear a little bit from you, Bill.
Mr. Miller, and he was talking about the history of Campbell County, how the settlers progressed down and went through the valleys, and before that, the Native Americans were in the valleys. When he talked about the Clinch and the Powell River, well, I'll go back to my father. When it was 3 weeks before he had to go to basic training in World War II, and he and a friend, borrowed a John boat and floated the Powell River all the way from Big Stone Gap, Virginia, down to what used to be known as Rogers Boat Dock in Campbell County. I forget what it's called now, but that he took a week and floated down, and they would trade the fish that they caught on the river for eggs and bacon at the farms along the river, so that they ate and had fun on their way before he went off to the military. I've been a resident of Campbell County for 50 years. I moved here when I was 12 years old from Wise, Virginia, which is about 130 miles up 53, going through Cumberland Gap. And my father was a coal miner in the Wise area, independent operator, and then worked for the Union mines. And he ended up with a job with the federal government working on mine safety. He was mine safety inspector for the for the federal government in Tennessee and Kentucky. And he ended up being the supervisor at the Jellicoe, Tennessee office there. And I moved here when I was 12 in the 6th grade. And probably one of the best things that happened in my life was to move to Tennessee. And it's where I dropped my roots. During the past 50 years, I've lived in Campbell County, about half of it, part of it Knoxville, part of it elsewhere in Granger County. I attended Jacksboro Elementary at that time, and Jacksboro High School, and then Campbell County High School, and left and went to the University of Tennessee, got my degree in geology, and became a coal geologist for a period of time, working doing permits for surface mines and deep mines here in Campbell County, as well as throughout East Tennessee and Kentucky, and a little bit in Virginia. And then that progressed as the coal industry took a huge hit economically in the early 80s, the energy glut. For those that are old enough to remember that, I moved to working in Oak Ridge at Oak Ridge National Laboratory as a contractor doing environmental work, because what one of the interesting things that I found in my life is how things cycle around. A lot of the techniques and the approaches to doing environmental work to clean up environmental issues or contamination came from the mining industry. If you look on TV or on films and you see the people in moon suits investigating or cleaning up something where they've got the big respirator and the tanks and the white suit and the gloves and the boots, all of that came from the coal mining industry, because the safety issues were created to protect miners in the 1950s and the 1960s, and it was a complete carryover of that, both for respiratory protection and as simple things as hard hats that we see everywhere started out for coal miners for the most part. And so it's interesting how one industry created, carries through and has ramifications and benefits that move throughout the entire industry. And a lot of those techniques are still used today in some of the most complex, environmental problems in the world. And I ended up moving back to Campbell County about 20 years ago from that, and have been working out of there ever since. When I was looking at your previous episode with Mr. Miller, and he was talking about the history of Campbell County and how the settlers moved in here, and the fact that it was at one time virgin forest, and the mountains and the valleys and everything. And it goes back. If you look at the history of the Southern Appalachians, with the rural areas especially, and the small towns and cities, the economy and the livelihood has been resource driven during its entire history. And for the most part, it remains to be that way today. At first, it was subsistence farming and subsistence hunting, and followed by the timber industry, which radically changed both the economy and the way the mountains looked and the way we operated. And as the timber was taken out, on practices that are abhorrent today but were normal at that time. And that was followed by the mining industry. In Campbell County, it was the coal industry, and to a limited extent, the iron industry, and that created the railroads that were also supported by the timber industry. As the rivers came through, and then you look further, you get closer to when TVA moved in and dammed up the Clinch and the Powell rivers to make Norris Lake. That affected the land, but the resources really drove the economy. In the past, Campbell County was a huge coal producer in the state of Tennessee. Where I grew up in Wise County, it was, a very large coal producer as well. And as those resources have been expended, and the economics of energy have changed the way coal mining is affected, it changed, and it affected every one of us in the mining culture. I remember, in growing up, you would go around the courthouse in Wise and Appalachia and Big Stone, and you could tell the miners on Saturdays that worked the deep mines, because they'd be sitting around whittling a stick, but they were squatting down because that's what they were used to doing in the mines. And so they were comfortable doing that. Now, you're obviously in better shape than I am, but I would bet money neither one of us could squat on our haunches for more than 10 minutes without feeling it. But, these guys would do it for hours at a time. To get back to your question, the land changed as we changed. And so now we have to think about, from my perspective, we need to think about the land and the country around us and how we can work with it, because it's a wonderful resource. Campbell County is unique in that over 46% of the land in this county is public land. So that's an amazing percentage, especially for the eastern United States. We're blessed. We've got TVA land. Formerly that was farmland that was owned by private individuals, but that's a different subject, but it's now public land. So a major part, almost half of our land is public land that you can go and use. I can go and use. Well, we have to deal with that and take care of it, because it's not going to take care of itself. And as I came back and got reintroduced to Campbell County, I was an active member in the Rocky Mountain Elk Foundation, and RMEF had teamed with CORA to bring the elk into Tennessee. And so I became a fairly active member of CORA over the years. And CORA, Campbell Outdoor Recreation Association, it's a unique organization in that it's one of probably the best grassroots story of making change about land use and land management in the United States. If you can imagine 8 to 10 people getting together and creating an organization that raised money to pay the land taxes, so that ultimately, 140,000 acres of land were bought for the public good, and it was created, in the courthouse room by a group of people, some of which, took out a second mortgage on their house to start the financing on this, and then, worked with the state of Tennessee to get that land for everybody's use, whether you hike, whether you bike, whether you use an ATV, a UTV, you want to hunt, you want to bird watch. And the story of those really dedicated people, cast and blast crew is what they were, that went out and made this happen. It's probably one of the best stories and untold stories of what dedicated and passionate people can do within the system to create a change. And to a limited extent, it may be an unappreciated thing because its story is over 30 years old, and we all take it for granted. I take it for granted, and I'm a member of CORA till I go back and read about that. But you talk about the land and how it is. It's interesting, and a lot of that land in the WMA, as we've all gone by. I hope we've all had the opportunity to go up and see the elk viewing tower and the land around it. That's all reclaimed surface mines from the coal industry, from the 40s, the 50s, 60s, 70s, the 80s, and it's now habitat. It is great habitat for wildlife and for game, and for people to go out and enjoy it. There's a hidden a hidden wealth of wonder out there just in our back door. I mean, you go out west to Bryce Canyon and you hear about the hoodoos and these great sandstone pillars that are out there. Well, if you know where to go on the Cumberland Trail, we've got them here. And they're not as dramatic because they're predominantly a different type of sandstone and limestone and some shale, but they're out there. And when you walk up on them, they take your breath away. And there are waterfalls hidden on these trails and on these UTV trails. And so I think it's important that we help to care for that. Yeah, you and I were talking a little bit about Greg's talk, and I kind of went off on a sidebar about the coke ovens, and the whole thing came around to cycles and how things relate to one another, which I was trying to mention a little bit about the history of resource use and everything. And Wise, Norton, Appalachia, Virginia, huge coal producing areas. In fact, there's still more unmined coal in that county than there is in the state of Tennessee combined. And it was very high quality coal, and all the railroad tracks were lined with coke ovens, open throat beehive coke ovens, of which we have the ruins of several of them still in LaFollette. And they ran 24 hours a day there. And when I hear people talk about air pollution and how dirty it is, I tend to laugh at myself a little bit, because compared to the way it was when I grew up in the 60s, we're in almost pristine conditions. Yeah, we've got a lot of work to do, and there are things we can do. But everything is relative. When I grew up as a kid, I never saw the night sky, and you really never saw the blue sky during the day. And the reason for it was that the coke ovens worked 24/7, 365 days a year, and that smoke would hang in the valleys. So everything was tinged in a gray and a brown of the smoke and the coal dust that covered the entire community. And at night, the glow from the coke ovens would actually light the smoke that was over the coke ovens. So it looked like it was always sunset, even at 2 or 3 in the morning when you looked on the horizon. Because when I would look out of the back of our yard, there was always this continual orange glow of the glow from the burning coal making coke being reflected off the bottom of the smoke. And for those of you that may have read J.R.R. Tolkien, growing up, I described it to you. It was like you were walking inside Mordor at that time, because it was always dark. It was always smoky. You could tell a family that had been to the store and bought new underwear, because they would be the only people in the neighborhood when they washed them the first time where they were white, because there was so much smoke that on the clotheslines to dry the clothes, after they'd been out there for an hour or two, they would be brown, light tan, and instead of white, because of all the smoke that was there continuously. And that was the way our families made their money at that time, and it put food on the table. So all of those things, it's real easy to cast it as a bad thing, but that's how we were able to eat growing up, and I'm sure it was that way for a lot of families here in LaFollette and in Campbell County and Angelico at that time too, because that was how everybody made a living off the resources. But it was always interesting. You grow up, and then as the coke ovens disappeared and the coal industry changed and the demand for that changed and they closed down, it just kind of naturally cleaned up. And so you had to think about it, and it took you triggering that when Mr. Miller talked for me to remember that. I've been blessed in my life to be part of this community. I'm married here and was blessed in joining a wonderful family. And it's one of those things sometimes you don't realize what you have and how important it is until you don't have it. It's like the old saying that I was told, you never appreciate a good neighbor till you have a bad one. And sometimes you don't appreciate what home is until you move away from it and you get a chance to come back. So I'm looking forward to this. I count myself as one of the fortunate ones that I'm able to have that perspective.
All right, that'll do it for tonight's episode, and I hope you enjoyed your time with Mr. Miller and Mr. Stanley, and look forward to hearing more from Mr. Stanley in the future, and Mr. Miller's going to come back too. Now, also, as always, I hope that inspired you to share your stories with us. And all you have to do is just reach out to us on the information I'm going to put up on the next screen and just have a chat with us. All right? And we'll see you again in 2 weeks on Wednesday, March 24th at 8:30 p.m. as we talk and explore even more about the local timber industry, coal industry, ore industry, and we chat with some more folks here locally about their experiences. So once again, reach out to us, talk with us, chat with us, and let's just kind of sit on the front porch together and enjoy each other's company. Thank you so much for staying with us tonight, and thank you so much for supporting the Campbell County Trunk Show Postmark LaFollette, and WLAF.